second time that we're running this webinar. The first one was in May, pretty much a month ago. No, in fact, 2 months ago. Same day, but like 2 months ago. And this Action Learning Set Toolkit was launched 2 weeks earlier, so that's beginning of May, at the C100 Acceleration Workshop. So that's a platform comprised of businesses, government, cities, and academia, meeting twice a year in Europe and in North America. And so the story of how this Action Learning Set Toolkit came about is very closely linked to actually when I started the foundation and to the role that I'm playing here. So about 2 years ago, I started working for the foundation, and when I joined, so my background is in consulting, organizational development, culture change, learning and leadership development, and my background is learning design. So when I joined the foundation, I looked at how we can turn all these theoretical concepts and conceptual ideas of the circular economy into practice. How can we help organizations be able to apply that thinking, the principles, and move beyond a very intellectual conversation? And so this was the initial question that I started with. How can we most effectively educate and skill up our organization, or organizations that we're working with, to move towards a circular economy? And in order to do that, in fact, one model that I have found quite useful is this framework that talks about awareness, association, and agency. So awareness is what we probably understand quite easily from the word itself, is to have an understanding and the theory, the idea, to be able to articulate that. And association is to be able to come together with peers, being mentored by somebody, so coming together in a group, so more than one, to actually work on something, and that could be a network, it could be anything larger than that as well. And agency is the motivation, the individual motivation I have, the drive, the willpower, but it is also the skill sets to be able to realize something. And the importance of them coming together. So if awareness is missing, or association or agency, the other two will not be able to make change happen. So this is a model that has been developed by David Ballard, who is a researcher and lecturer at the University of Bath, working at the Center for Action Research and Professional Practice. And he's been working with businesses and consulting them on sustainability-related topics for about 20 years or so. So this is where action learning comes in, because as I mentioned earlier, we need awareness, association, and agency. And an agency is the one that I personally felt was the one that we need to develop most strongly, because there's a lot of information out there around circular economy. People have started to come together, and but how can we help within the agency of the willpower, the upskilling, to help people understand what they can do and how they can do it? And so what this is showing here on the slide is showing that it's not enough to only look at theory itself and to develop, let's say, a mastery level or an in-depth level of understanding, but it's also important that you apply what you're learning and start, prototyping, start testing new ideas, start really going for it before you have all the answers. And in that process, going back between theory and practice, you, on both sides, develop from a beginner level to a practitioner level to a mastery level of being able to apply these different theoretical concepts. But in return, as you're applying them, testing them, prototyping, you're also able to enrich your understanding and your conceptual understanding of how circular economy could look like. So the Action Learning Set Toolkit was a prototype that we kicked off in April 2018. And that was to see how can we help businesses that have access to the e-learning that the Ellen MacArthur Foundation provides, but need to take the next step of creating more engagement in their organizations to get people on board and to start getting into action, the realization of these ideas. And so we have come at that point of time, created Action Learning Set pilots with around 12 organizations. I think we in total get about 80 participants. And most of the organizations came from the corporate sector. And so what they did is during their time as they were engaging on with the e-learning program, which is consisting of 5 modules going into different topics, functional topics such as finance, strategy, marketing, sales, supply chain. They were in parallel working in Action Learning Sets. So that's a fixed group of 5 to 7 participants coming together, always the same people, during regular meetups. So after every module that they would have finished online doing the e-learning, let's say they just finished the marketing one, they would come together soon after to bring their circular economy challenges that they're facing, or challenges that they're facing, to bring this concept to life in the marketing domain in their organization. And so it's a small group, you could say almost a discussion forum, but with a strong action orientation, where at each meeting one person brings a case. And that is being discussed, and the encouragement of that, and the accountability and the peer support they've been receiving help them to then apply these ideas, and in the consecutive meeting report back how that has gone. So why use this toolkit? In very simple terms, we solve problems better and faster if we bring people together to share their stories and collaborate. And this toolkit helps professionals to do that in a productive way. So it gives them the structures, the templates, the handouts, the timelines, whatever help is needed, the structures needed to do that in an effective way. And in the process of doing that, to jointly find better ways to integrate the circular economy design principles, the theoretical concepts into their business. So the beginnings of Action Learning Sets, there's a little story I want to share with you. Back in the 1930s, Reg Revens, a young PhD student in astrophysics at Cambridge University, was working alongside 8 Nobel Prize winners, and none of them worked in his field. But he noticed that when they were faced with difficult research problems, they would sit down together and ask one another lots of questions. No one person was considered more important than any other, and they all had contributions to make, even when they were not experts in that particular field. So in this way, they teased out workable solutions to their own and other problems. And Revens was quite struck by how powerful this technique was. So when he went to work for the Coal Board, he introduced this technique there. And when pit managers had problems, he encouraged them to meet together in small groups on site to discuss their issues by asking one another questions about what they saw. And this allowed them to find their own solutions rather than being experts, rather than bringing in external experts or even internal ones to solve their problems. So this technique proved so successful, and managers went on to write their own handbook on how to run a coal mine. So some years later, Professor Reg Revens tested and formalized that theory, which now forms the basis of this particular Action Learning Set process, which, by the way, there's loads of articles, loads of toolkits, maybe not quite in the same format like we have it here because this has a particular angle, but it's been a concept that's been used, an approach that's been used across different sectors, also outside businesses, in education, academia, NGOs, governmental institutions. And it is the cornerstone of many management and organizational development programs. So when I worked for a London-based consultancy, we used it with a couple of different of our clients, sometimes over 3 or 6 months period as part of a culture change process or as part of some strategic projects that they were tackling. Okay, so I'm just going to pause. You see on the screen here now the definition. Are there any questions at this point? And just bear in mind you have to unmute yourself if you want to ask anything. Okay, I'm not seeing any raised cups yet or anything else. Good. Okay, let's carry on. So how to get started? If you're in, so I suppose the first step would be really to, if you haven't done that yet, to go to the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website and download the tool. You can do that quite easily by going to the C100 Learning Resource section. We do ask people to enter a few details about themselves. They're anonymous. We're not asking you to give your name. We just want to better understand, which audience group is interested in downloading these tools. So that's for internal purposes. But I think it's 3 questions that you are being asked before being able to download it, and you will not be part of a newsletter or receive any follow-up email from us. So yeah, once you have read it and you came to the conclusion that this is a good way forward, because you're working on a particular project, you want to work with some colleagues who are also interested in circular economy, or your organization has already made a decision, or your network that you want to advance this work. The questions to ask yourself is, what are we trying to do in our organization, and how could circular economy or the ideas help in that thinking or in achieving these strategic objectives? Then what's quite important is for you to think about, what is this question or the challenge I'm trying to solve? Is there anything that I'd like to work on with the group? So let's say, just to pick an example, working across the supply chain with our suppliers in a more circular way, assessing, looking at how we can best assess how circular our suppliers are. So that might be, the more concrete it gets, the harder it gets, because it is not meant to be to create a very task-focused, almost like a project team to solve a particular issue. It is more looking at the bigger picture, the questions, the more systemic, the more complex issues you might be facing, and how to address that. So it is really an opportunity to address those questions you might be shying away from, or that you over a glass of wine, maybe with a friend, you might raise, but on an everyday work situation, you might raise it in a strategic meeting, but you might not have time to take the time off to actually try to tackle that. And who are the right people to join this action learning set? So this could be, what we are promoting is to bring a lot of diversity into meetings like that. So this was one of the major benefits that the participants from the prototype were reporting. So the testing phase we had last year, that it brought people together within an organization who worked across different business functions, and otherwise would have not had the chance to address some of these organizational issues but with different lenses, different backgrounds, and that generated insights and also an alliance and a momentum for some of them to broaden the conversations within the organization. And lastly is to look at what roles are involved. So the guide has quite a detailed outline of all roles, and yeah, so you'll get a lot of support on that. Okay, so I need to go to the next slide. There you go. Right, on the process itself. So there's a very generic flow, and it's always the same. And you're very welcome to adapt that flow. But the important bit is that it's a flow that one works for you and works within the time that you have to meet, and that it is there's a rhythm. So you're not creating a different agenda at each time that you meet. So you could summarize the 5 points. It is the first one is different because the first one is an intro. Really, you need to ideally allocate an extra 30 minutes to help the group to get to know each other, set the ground rules for the work. But then consequently, it's 4 rough items of what you cover. Is you do the check-in, where you just hear from everybody in the space, where they're at, whether they're what particular circular economy challenge they're facing. Then what particular issue they'd like to work on in this session. You have the individuals sharing their case in more detail. So that's deciding after the check-in which case you want to focus on, and sometimes you might already in advance who that is. And you probably have time for about 1 to 2 of these shares in one meeting. Then there's a group conversation element where having explored that issue in more detail, asked questions, understood the context, you then have the chance to do some peer-to-peer coaching. This is to ask, to brainstorm solutions, brainstorm ideas of what could possibly be done, but also a chance to, again, hear from different people, possibly hear what has worked well for others, and also in different departments. And then finally the wrap-up, where the person who presented a particular case, a particular challenge, has a chance to share back to the group of what they, how this has been useful to them, what they're taking away from this session, and for the entire group to capture their insights. So it's a chance again to hear from everybody in the room, similar to the check-in, to see what their key takeaways are from the session. And what our suggestion is that by the end of this entire process, so let's say you might say that we have a 3 months action learning set time frame to work on this particular piece of content, we suggest that by the end of it you reflect as a group on how this entire process has been for you and capture these learnings as well. Should you ever want to start a new action learning set process with a similar group or a completely new group, they can learn from the previous experiences. Okay. So now what we're doing is we have for each of these 4 steps, in fact the 5, including the introduction, a slide prepared here for you. So you'll receive the slide deck after the call as well as the recording. And I just wanted to spend a little bit of time to go through these so you know what I meant with each of these 4 steps and what that would look like. So this is on a fairly in-depth level to so the intention of this webinar is really for you to feel equipped to literally have, the level of understanding you need to make a decision whether you want to apply that in your context, and to orientate yourself also with the guide, who has then the necessary handouts and templates for you to pick up. So the introduction, if you don't know each other, to just hear again from everybody what their role is in the organization. They can say how long they've been in the organization to just get a bit of context, what they bring. And it does help probably in the beginning to establish what their level of familiarity is around circular economy. If you feel, if you're the one who's kicked this process off, so in some way you have some ownership of wanting to see this succeed, I would suggest that you provide some introductory material up front to every participant to get everybody to some foundational knowledge around circular economy. And there's plenty of material on our website, or you can approach me as well if you have questions around that. Some ground rules really help, and the purpose of that, and you can call it principles or golden rules, there are different names for that, is to agree a couple of things. There are a few suggested here. They are also in the toolkit. Feel free to adapt them. The one that is on top is the one that we recommend keeping in, confidentiality, for people to feel comfortable to talk about some of the difficulties they're facing and feel okay to do that. So check-in is an opportunity for people to all be heard when they come together, because you go one by one through the room, and whilst one person's speaking, the others are listening, and it helps people to arrive, be fully present, let go of whatever else is on their mind, maybe coming from a busy day. And the questions that are usually covered there is how you're doing, what have been your reflections since the last action learning set, so that's an ALS here. And to hear from everybody, also to see, is there anybody in the space who'd like to present a case in this action learning set? So once you have agreed that, sometimes it might just be one person, there might be maybe three sharing their cases and having an interest to, share in more depth in that particular meeting. You agree which the one or two candidates would be for that meeting, and so this is where then the individual share starts. And one thing in terms of roles, it would be really helpful to have somebody be the timekeeper throughout, and it doesn't have to be the one hosting, but there's more on roles coming later. So once the presenter or the person sharing, so when I say presenter, it might sound a bit formal. I don't mean that you have to have like a slick slide deck or anything. I mean literally just somebody who works on something they want to address in more detail, because they have the opportunity to get support from that group and go through an ideation process with them. So ultimately, it's in the person's favor, and everybody else in the process gets to learn from that as well. So what does the presenter do? It really helps to know before arriving to the meeting that you might want to present in that meeting, because what it does, it creates for you the responsibility to prepare well, to think about how you describe that in the most concise way, without getting lost in story and losing others in the process of your sharing, yeah, so you describe the concern and allow then others to ask questions and to better understand and get a bigger picture understanding of the context of this issue. And then what you do is you're going through the ideation process, and at the very end you decide on which action points you want to take forward. So certain things will speak to you more than others, and ideally you really then commit to taking next steps on what has come out of the meeting. So the group has been very present to this particular issue and on what you picked that you want to implement or take. And at the next meeting, you report back how this has gone. And it over the period of time that various people go through that process, it creates a way of testing assumptions, testing ideas, trying something new, different, gets you slightly out of your comfort zone, but you also have the peer support and you also have the accountability structure, because people want to see you test some of these maybe very crazy ideas. So you might actually go for it and give it a try. Group conversation is, so Sally is presenting, what does the group do? As a group member, you're being in service to what Sally needs. So as I said, it's a peer coaching format, which means that as a coach, you are listening attentively to what Sally is saying, and you make sure you understand what the situation is, so you ask clarifying questions, and you in the conversation afterwards, and particularly in the questions, what you're not doing is say, oh yeah, I heard that before, I've seen this before, I've been there before, I completely know what Sally should be doing, and give Sally advice straight away, like, you know, Sally, what you really should be doing, listen to me, is this. So this is not the role of the peers or the group in that conversation. So you help as a coach or as a peer group together, you help Sally come to the conclusions that she needs to have and find the right way forward. Yes. So good questions to ask for clarification. It's often easy to get into a story because of something you make it mean, and to add layers and layers of filters on it that might not be necessarily there. So these clarification questions by your peers help to actually uncover some of that and get to maybe the bottom of the issue, or possibly see it from a completely different way to what you perceived it to be in the beginning. So what happened? How do you see it? Why would you say that this is this way? Yes, so who will be affected if you are successful? Who might help you? So it's also trying to already start to identify resources that might be available, potential future barriers or obstacles that are in the way, and probing questions, you know, say a bit more, go deeper, what exactly, why would that matter? How does that make you feel? You know, so you take it where the group feels comfortable. So none of that is like a must-have list of things to do, to ask. It's just literally some guidance, and you might find your very own questions that work for you. But what it tries to do, and this is what I'm trying to get to, is it tries to go under the surface of what's visible, because we tend to be maybe reactive, we already have the answers, and this process really helps to maybe step back and look, okay, do we really have the answers? Do I need to maybe just stop, already be in my very judgmental mode? In fact, not just the presenter, but for anybody in the room, and to try to explore what underlying assumptions are driving that aspire decision, or that kind of view, or that stuckness. And by getting to the level of assumptions or feelings or some of these topics that we don't usually talk about, you might actually feel that maybe the situation is not that stuck after all, or that there are other pathways that have not been seen before. So all of what I just described is, so this is pretty much a summary, you could say. It's the GROW peer coaching model. So GROW stands for goal, understanding what the goal is, R for reality. So what is the current reality around this issue? O for options, what ideas do we have to address that? And W for way forward. So what are the next steps? What support, what resources do you need? And how do you know you've achieved it? Things like that. So this process, as is outlined here, is perfectly doable in an hour. In fact, it would be less than an hour, because you need time for the check-in and the wrap-up and everything else. But it does help to have a timekeeper. And one of the things that most often, well, go wrong, I want to say, well, where the pitfall is of this process is that you might indulge spending too much time in the first two steps, and not enough time particularly in the purple, the options, the ideation phase. So if I was to give percentages, I would say, you know, this is where preparation is so important. Be concise, say what the goal is, what you're after, and the issue is, so that, you know, might maybe take 10-15% of that time. Spend a bit of time in reality, that might be another, you know, let's say 15%, and then spend about 60% in options. So this is really where you want to spend the majority of your time, to dig deeper, to be open about different ways, and there are brainstorming tools out there that you can use, and the questions here also give some guidance in the toolkit, before you then go into the way forward. So good questions for ways forward, well, new ways forward. So I think the most important is, what are your options for action now? Is to not, you know, whoever the presenter is, the sharer, to not let them leave the room without having clarity of what has been useful to them out of this conversation, and express, and to be able to really share that, and to clearly state what their next steps are. What are they going to do differently going forward? Or they might just pick one action, one particular. So the group then, you know, you might challenge that person. It's really up to you, depending on your level of understanding around the issue, or the rapport you have with each other. And anything else that might be useful, you know, in terms of who might be critical stakeholders to engage with. Yeah. And what can you maybe do even as a little step until the next meeting when we see each other again? Capture the key insights is the last step. So this is, as a group, to literally you cut at that point. You've done the content part in terms of this particular case that was discussed, and then you reflect on this entire process together. How has this been? How useful has this been? You know, if there's one thing that would make it even better, or a couple of things, what would that be? How can we make it a positive experience for all of us going forward? So, and in between meetings, you have those who prepare for sessions, you have those who come out of a session and reflect on their experience, because you know, for some it might be quite a big outcome of what has come out for them, and for them to take the necessary steps to schedule that in their diary or make it happen. Possibly reflect, journal. So there is a journaling practice, reflective writing practice outlined in the toolkit as well, in the appendix, to help you either in preparation for the meeting or afterwards, to make sense of what you heard, what came up for you being in that process, and how you're feeling about the next steps. And yeah, ideally, if you have this journaling practice, if you're able to regularly journal throughout the entire process, it will help you to become much more aware. Speaking of seeing the bigger system, you know, helping you to see the different parts of the system, the different stakeholders, the different kind of maybe competing goals, whatever. It's but also how you're feeling about what's going on, and where some of the dynamics are that might be either enabling you or stopping you. So all of these aspects that are not always on top of our mind in the everyday busy lives that we're having is really quite useful to surface through a journaling practice. And this is just an example from the toolkit of after and before. The types of questions we're asking to help you with that journaling practice. And yeah, this is a guidance for you. Again, you could completely change the questions, whatever works for you, and do some free flow writing where you just write whatever comes up for 10 minutes and don't follow any questions. So that also works quite well. a few further tips before we come to the end. Do's and don'ts. So what ideally you do have in place or pay attention to is if you do have more than one person sharing, to have an equal amount of time for each person, listen attentively, really try to suspend that judging voice in your mind that already has the answers for everything. One could argue it's a very linear way to see that, like already knowing the answers and jumping straight to solutions. And this is very often, quite fairly frequently quoted text by Albert Einstein, where he said, we can't solve the problem with the mind that created the problem in the first place. So listening attentively and attempting to see things from other people's point of view really help us to expand the way we see things and step back and pause and not go into that responsive or reactive way of addressing topics, but actually try to change the way we see things and ideally not solve the issue from the same mind that created it, but actually evolve our thinking and our mind along the way. Be mindful of what questions you're asking and what would be really useful in that moment to that person. Is that question really that important in the first place? Less is more, maybe, to not be bombarded with questions. And respect and values everyone's capacity to take their own decision. So it relates back to having an opinion and trying to be open about, what's best for that person, even though if you think, it should be a different way that they proceed, or they should have picked a different idea. The avoids are, probably quite obvious when you read them. Interrupting in a flow, imposing your own values, views, already having an answer, being judgmental about what should happen, and assuming that their situation is similar to the one that you have experienced. It's like, oh, that's exactly what happened to me. So yes, these probably quite obvious ones. The role of the host. So out of these 12 action learning set proto pilots that we ran last year, the ones that worked the best, and they reported back that they had a really positive experience. It helped them to share knowledge with each other, to create these ties, these alliances almost across the organization, and inspire people with new ideas. Were the ones that were actually hosted by somebody dedicated. And most of these examples were action learning sets that had one person throughout the entire process being dedicated as a host. There were a few examples where the host role rotated, and that worked out fine as well. So the role of the host could even possibly be the one kicking off this entire action learning set, but doesn't have to be. If you were thinking around kicking it off in your organization, you could also identify a host and hand it over and not be part of the action learning set yourself. And likewise, in the first meeting, somebody might come forward and literally just volunteer to be a host because it's something they could see themselves do well. So it's holding the process and helping the group to flow, to go with the agenda that's suggested here, to arrive at a satisfactory place by the end of it, to not run out of time halfway through or feel rushed. And so it's not necessary to be the timekeeper yourself. You might want to have somebody else do that role, but it's just to be aware that it's looking after almost the well-being of the group to accomplish what they set themselves out to do during this process. And there's also a whole lot of role modeling involved. So, as a host, you probably want to ideally role model the types of questions that are being asked, or maybe intervene if you see people either not sticking to the ground rules or not particularly being helpful in the way they're asking. You might want to rephrase the question to make it clearer. So it has a bit of a facilitator character, but a light touch. And I mean, you could even argue that, you know, if people are quite familiar with the process, which they could be if they all have the handout and they understand the objectives and the flow, depending on the experience level, you might even be able to not have a host. But that, I would say, only works if the people in the room are fairly experienced or have a certain level of experiences like this, processes like that, but maybe are a bit more also professionally experienced and can relate to what it takes to get through a meeting and accomplish what needs to be done. So what's next? Well, let's just see, are there any, I don't see anybody asking to have questions at this point. So I'm just going through the next slide and then we can pause. So as I said, you'll receive the recording of the webinar and the Action Learning Set Toolkit. If you'd like to initiate an Action Learning Set in your organization, again, the questions that I raised at the very beginning of this presentation, what are we trying to do in our organization? How could the circular economy ideas and thinking help to accomplish that? Is there any particular challenge, any particular question or intention that I'm holding that I'd like to bring forward to a group and help enroll people around that question? And that question or challenge might change as the group comes together and they all share why they have come together, what's really of interest to them. It might slightly evolve, and by the time this Action Learning Set is kicking off, have maybe come to a different formulation and maybe potentially even a slightly different focus. And who are the right people to join? So with regards to experience level, with regards to understanding around circular economy, with regards to diversity, and how beneficial is it to them? So I think we've come to the end. So this is just to let you know where you can find the toolkit on our website. So this is when you go to our work, you get to see the C100 network, and within the C100 section, there's the learning resource section. Okay, thank you very much for listening so patiently. And so I just see that. Yeah, so halfway through, we had a question come in whether there will be a recording, and yes, we'll send you the recording afterwards. So, do you have any questions, anything you'd like to bring up, any comments, reactions? Feel free to challenge me on anything that I presented.
Monica.
Yeah.
Marcelo from Chile. For us, it's a big opportunity. We are beginning a program with 300 companies in our region, now in Temuco. And this methodology is basic for us. And I think that we can work now with this context. And for me, it's a big toolkit. I can work now with the company. We are beginning. We don't know much about the circular economy. And this is the first step for us. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. That's good to hear. Yes, so as you might have gathered, it is not helping people to understand exactly what a circular economy is. There are other resources. In fact, watch the space. Tomorrow we launch our Learning Hub online. So this will be on the Ellen MacArthur Foundation website, and on top of the menu bar you see circular economy. When you click there, you get straight to the Learning Hub. explains you everything about what is circular economy, introductory level, in-depth level, deep dives into fashion, deep dives into what it means for me and my business, into city circular economy, and goodness, what else do we have? I mean, there's basically, I think, around 8 or 9 tiles of different topics you can go into depth with. Plus, there's more on our learning resource section for further courses. There's a MOOC offered by TU Delft, and a free 6-week or 7-week long MOOC as an introduction.
I'm making this book.
So I'm trying to say that this is, as you said, it's more a participatory approach to get people into action without feeling overwhelmed by the conceptual ideas that they're encountering when they, hear for the first time what circular economy is about.
Can you hear me?
Oh yes, we can.
Oh, okay, perfect. I actually do have a quick question. So the toolkit, do we actually use it to solve issues within like the community and products and stuff like that, or is it more just to get people involved around like circular economic strategies?
Yeah, no, that's a good question. Yeah, so I can give you some examples. So when during the pilot phase, we worked with Danone, with Philips, with Intesa Sanpaolo, a large international bank, ING, another bank. Who else did we have? So we had, as you can tell, a couple of large corporates. H&M was also involved. And the kind of topics that the professionals brought were things like, how do we create a narrative within our business that engages people, engages the employees to feel that they can be part of the journey, and that they start engaging with that thinking within their own departments. So that was related to, let's say, comms and marketing, more internal comms, but still an important aspect that can also be brought into their marketing. And so in the very first get together, where people shared their introductions and shared the different areas they came from and the different areas they work on and feel challenged by, we could hear examples like that. So this was now the narrative challenge. And there was another challenge on creating, that came on from packaging, from a company that comes from a fast-moving consumer good industry, and they needed to rethink their packaging, their plastic bottles, and what else could they put in place. So, so that was more of an engineering design question. So we left that for the when we talked about research and innovation, the R&D section of that particular e-learning module. But basically what it showed very quickly is that everybody in the room had a very valid, very business-oriented question from very different angles. How do I engage my suppliers and help them come on board and be an ally and a partner in this, and to help them start thinking about how they become more circular in their activity. Or in, how do we transform the procurement process? So they're meant to really be in service of what the organization would need to deal with to address some of these difficult situations or, questions.
So it's more from the, like, I guess the toolkit really comes into play from like stakeholder engagement and the insight phase. But once you move into, say, like, how do we redesign a community, around circular economics, like what's happening in the Netherlands and stuff like that, would it be different toolkits you would utilize at that point, or does this still fall into play at that step too?
Yeah, so, okay, interesting. I suppose you could argue that at some point you might want to do a design sprint, because then it becomes quite concrete. You already have an idea, there's something, that there's a particular need you want to address, you want to design different, maybe prototypes to address that need, and it's very work focused. It's to come up with something concrete and to test that, and there's something at stake. And so I think if it's going down that route, I would probably advise to go more with a sort of rapid prototyping, design thinking approach. The design sprints are perfect for that. I think this particular toolkit probably helps to get to something that then could be the brief for a design sprint, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. I just wanted to figure out like where to utilize the kit
Well,
most effective, especially when
you're breaking up a little.
engaging. I work with the mayor's office and the Office of Sustainable Development, stuff like that.
Yeah, so you're coming more from a government perspective, government community perspective.
Exactly, government, nonprofits, and then you need the infrastructure in place before all the other business models will really fit into that and prosper. So
Yeah.
and a lot of these cities, you have to develop that first, and then you can move down into all the other aspects.
Yeah, so I don't know how early on in this webinar you got to see the slides, but there was one slide early on that talked about the awareness association and agency framework, and so this toolkit helps to create awareness around the topic. It helps to create association, as in you come together with others to explore this topic a bit more deeply, to enrich in your own understanding, and to go further in your own questioning of what would work and what's needed. And it also helps you in terms of the agency to start feeling a personal connection to it, to start noticing, okay, I am motivated now to actually start doing something about this, and I start to see potential pathways what I could be doing in terms of the agency to be called to do something. But at the same time, you might not have all the skills and all the answers. You might not have that mandate yet within your organization. I mean, so this, so I think that the toolkit is one that is more as an initial engagement process on these three domains in that framework. And it works quite nicely on all three of them. Possibly even more on the association and agency bit, but definitely still has, is supporting the to increase awareness. But it's not, necessarily where once you have that agency, once you have that commitment, I need to design something, a new service product, I need to come up with an answer. There's something in place already, and that you're required to do. Then I think that then starts to. I suppose you could argue that even then the Action Learning Center Toolkit could be useful to bring different perspectives together, to bring different, to still have a way of ideating in a light touch way, because your case is only shared once in a meeting that lasts in total maybe 60 to 90 minutes. So, it will never replace like the full-blown, let's think that through with a team and do a couple of days or weeks or months of a design phase process, but it will certainly spark off some inspiration which way you could take it to.
Okay, perfect. So I guess insight, and then move into more, I guess, like a traditional strategy in terms of like urban design development or product development and stuff like that.
Yeah, and I mean yes. So, but there are also quite participatory design processes out there. There are so that I can refer you to one tool that's publicly available. Actually, it's on the Naman Design Agency. I'm going to type that into the text box because it's really good. So they're based in Belgium, and at our last acceleration workshop, they delivered. They actually introduced their systemic design toolkit, which is really thorough, an amazing slide deck and material and everything. And that looks into participatory cross-sectoral design process to address, how you can design for systemic change and for bigger, bigger picture, I suppose, changes that need to happen. That it will not help you with maybe designing a new yogurt cup. It is meant to look at maybe the big issues like the healthcare system, or how do we reduce poverty in this particular district and in a city.
Which is critical, because I feel like that's one of the first steps towards really embedding circular economics and stuff like that, is because all the businesses fall behind a lot of that type of stuff in wide adoption versus like a few startups taking on the challenge of things here and there. But what's the name of that toolkit? The Systemic Design Toolkit? Is that it?
Yes, I put that in the chat box as well. Systemic Design
Okay.
Toolkit, and it's offered by the Naman Design Agency, so NAMAHN.
Perfect. I appreciate it.
You're welcome. Okay, so I think, well, thanks very much for asking the question, and thanks everybody for attending today and actually hanging in there, because we have run over now. So if there's anybody still desperate for a question, feel free to ask, and I suppose I would just like to say goodbye to everybody else who attended, in case you need to move on and carry on with your day. Thank you.